Tony Tonkin here from the Child Protection Party. Now, there's a few things that we need to talk to you about tonight, so we're asking you to join in, to have this conversation with us about two particular topics. So the first one is we're going to discuss with Clinton de Young, our current president, actually, of the Child Protection Party. We'll explain later on as to why that's the case. And we're going to have a chat to Clinton about an article that he discovered in the Western Australian, which concerns all of us. I do need to say that I've only got the audio with Clinton, haven't quite got the video, the video worked out. So we've got this fabulous photograph of Clinton. So I don't know how you want to work this, Clinton. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about the article, then I'll bring it up and we'll have a conversation about it, and you can tell me more from there. Go for it.
Yeah, good evening. So this morning when I was just waking up, I usually scroll through the news and see what's happened while I was asleep. And unfortunately this morning we woke up to a really grim story. And that was the story of a 20-month-old foster boy. Now we can't tell you his name or the area because obviously that would identify him. So everything's been blurred out. But he was 20 months old, and he was essentially murdered. That charge is convicted, so we can say that he was murdered by his foster mother. And so while we're talking about this story, we're not turning it into a witch hunt for foster carers. We do recognise that there's a lot of foster carers here in Australia that do some really good work, some fantastic, really good work. You know, people like Wendy, who's on our Child Protection Party executive. We have a lot of good foster carers in Australia, but there's obviously some really bad ones, which has come out from this story today.
So I'll just run through the story for everybody to have a look at. So you'll be able to find this story actually on the Child Protection Party webpage. So we've got a copy of it there. If anybody wants to have a look at it, feel free to do so. So the title is Little Boy Lost, 20-month-old let down by Australia's child protection system. And it describes this little boy. It's a fabulous article because it talks about how sweet, how beautiful, how gorgeous this little kid was. He's only 20 months old. And what a lovely little kid. And I think this is, look, the loss of any child is horrific. The loss of a child of any age is just indescribable as far as I'm concerned. But the circumstances under which children die matters, and this one certainly does. The writer states what makes this story uglier is the little boy was a vulnerable foster child. His murderer, the 45-year-old mother, entrusted to keep him safe. He is the victim of a monster and shoddy child protection system. And there's no one here at the Child Protection Party who will deny that. And certainly, of course, the people that we work with, parents whose kids have been removed, would also agree with this. And I think that what this says, Clinton, is that this is the horrible side. Child protection is horrible in many, many areas because the system fails parents and children over and over again. We know that just simply by many removals that don't need to take place. So we know the system is a crappy system. It's dysfunctional. And as I said last week on our feed, I speak to people all the time now who have left the child protection departments, who are social workers, who talk about the terrible ways in which they do work. And here we have a decision has clearly been made for this child to be with this particular foster parent. And look, I concur on everything you said, Clinton, that at the end of the day, this is not about battering foster parents. I know plenty of foster parents who just do the most outstanding job and do their best to fit in sometimes really difficult circumstances. So we're not having a go at foster parents. I want everybody to understand that. And it says, so it goes on to say, and a society that cares even less because this little boy was Indigenous. And I think that this is look, the system cares less about some of these kids simply because they suggest that the environment which they come from, where they've labelled parents as bad parents and they're not prepared to work with the parents or whatever, that that in itself we kind of I find horrific. I find that it doesn't matter about the person's colour of a person's skin, their ethnicity, their religious background. None of that should matter. But for some reason, it does, because we work within a child protection system that is racist, that is misogynist, that is that is extremely patronising in the way that they work, and that it's an horrific system. And even when I said they're misogynist, I mean they blame women a lot for what happens within families, and particularly families where there's violence and abuse, and particularly where women have developed issues around mental well-being as a result of that violence and abuse. So they are misogynist. The women and most of the people that we work with, the social workers are women, they are misogynist. And because this kid is Indigenous, the system just didn't seem to care about him, or they cared even less about him. And I think that in itself is horrific. His foster mother blamed the child for his own death. He was 20 months old, for God's sake. What idiot could blame the mother? I don't know, Clinton, whether you want to talk about that or not. Just jump in, mate, if you've got something to say.
How shocking. 20 months old. I mean, you're at that age. You've done absolutely nothing wrong in the world, in life. You've honestly done nothing wrong, and to be treated in this way from someone who just has a complete, I mean, it actually sounds like she has some mental health issues, but just to treat a child like this, I mean, just shy of 2 years old.
Yep, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Clearly, the foster mother has mental well-being issues herself, and yet somehow this foster mother was allowed to look after this kid, and to blame the child for his own death being 20 months old is bizarre, given the injuries that had happened to this child. There's a picture here in loving memory and they've blocked out the names. I think on this tombstone is also the child's biological mother, if I remember correctly from the story.
It is. So the biological mother, obviously, she had her own vices, she had her own weaknesses, she had some addictions. But how sad, how awful. Look at that tombstone. They're both on there together. Obviously, I can't imagine the shock of what she went through of when she found out that, her little boy has been murdered.
And I think I got a sense too, Clint, from the article that she was herself extremely traumatized by the removal of her son. And that led her eventually, I think, to her own demise. But the article goes on to say Justice Kavanagh, who was the magistrate attending to this case, was not convinced. After presiding over the 3-week trial alone, he told the court, "I do not know precisely what was done to the child, but I am satisfied that the only reasonably possible explanation was some form of deliberate and forceful assault on him. On the evidence before me, there is no other person who could have assaulted the deceased in his home that night. He died in vain because his life had even begun. But I can't tell you his name. I can't show you his face. The court prevents me. His killer's identity is masked too. The sucker punch to long-awaiting justice. She's been convicted of the most heinous crime one can commit, but there will be no public shame. There is no exception to this rule, even for murderers." And I just want to make some comments about that because one of the rules or legislation pieces that I think need to be changed is when a child is murdered, that the issues around, identifying the family and all that sort of shit really goes out the window. It's at this particular point we should say, well, certainly the child's not going to be harmed from this, but certainly we need to further humiliate and shame the murderer. In other words, the foster parent in this particular case needs to be humiliated, because taking a child's death under these circumstances is the most horrific crime that one can commit. And I think that we need to do something, and I'm going to talk about this at the end of this, about some ways by which we should be able to change legislation so that people like the person writing this article can talk about these people openly, that we can identify the child, and we can identify others that may have been involved in the child's demise. And it just says here that he was born in July 2013 in Dubbo in regional New South Wales to a biological mother who adored him and hoped that his arrival would mark a change in the direction of her life. And how many times do we hear that, Clinton, from women who are struggling with domestic violence and other issues, mental health issues, and along comes a child, and this child represents to them a new beginning, a new way of starting things, a new life, if you like, through which they can express even their own. Do you want to comment about that?
And then Child Protection come in and they make it 100 times worse. And they alienate the parents and they remove the child, and sometimes that child gets put in worse circumstances than from what it was removed.
Yeah, because we fail. We fail as a society, and social workers in particular, our profession, your and my profession, fail to be able to find appropriate ways to work with parents so that they can address the issues that sit in their lives and have their children return to them. There is a possibility, without knowing the full circumstances, that someone could have worked with this mother so that she could have enjoyed the thrill, the joy of having this child in her life and raising this child in a productive way. But no, she didn't get that chance, probably because the department viewed her as Aboriginal, someone that they decided that there was just beyond reach, that they couldn't help, that whatever the reasons are, who knows, whatever they are, they're bloody racist. Therefore, the child was placed in foster care with a foster parent who killed him. How sad is all of that? So he was born in July 2013 in Dubbo in regional New South Wales to a biological mother who adored him, hoped that his rival back could change the direction of her life, as we were saying. She had struggled with addictions but wanted her this time around to be different. That's why, and a lot of parents will say that, this is a new beginning for them. That's why when things at home with the little boy's father became dangerous, so she was in a DV relationship, it was her decision to reach out for help. He wasn't taken from her. Foster care was to be oh God, how many times do we hear this? Foster care was to be a temporary transition until she could battle her way to safety. And it was uniting, I think that's part of Uniting Care, the non-government foster care provider to which he was entrusted. But 2 months later, he died. I'm working with a woman at the moment who has she's got 5 kids. She's tried to escape from this abusive relationship 3-4 times, and the department and Housing SA have not been able to find her a place in which she can live. So she returns back to the abusive relationship. And recently, the department got involved because of her homelessness and because she was in a DV relationship. But the system itself failed to provide her with the assistance she simply required. She required a home for herself and 5 kids so she could escape the violent relationship. But they failed her, just like this woman here was failed. She identified the problem, was probably prepared to work around those issues, and the system put her into a foster care arrangement, which they said was temporary. So he wasn't taken from her. He was, because he was placed in foster care. Foster care was to be temporary transition.
And just a point to add, in this part of the story, it's really a crossroad of the things that were to come. Obviously the police were called to this house. There were some domestic violence issues. Obviously, she'd hit the fan, and obviously the perpetrator wasn't removed. Nothing was done. The victim and the child had to leave. They had to leave their home, and the child had to leave their home. The perpetrator had to stay there, and they could carry on their life. What if happened if today we took the perpetrator away, removed them? 100% that child would most likely still be alive today.
And what would happen too, Clinton, if we certainly choose to remove the perpetrator, which is the way it should be done, and put appropriate measures in place so that the penalties for him coming back to that home and further abuse were so severe that the man would remain in jail for a long, long time. At the moment, someone recently told me that, apprehension and violence orders aren't worth the paper that they're printed on. And they're probably not, because judges are too lenient in not locking these people up for any length of time, and I guess the legislation restricts that. But that's one of those things that needs to be changed so that women can be protected from such violent men. Just want to go back. We'll just finish doing this article. His biological... So 2 months later, he was dead. His biological mum is now dead. She never recovered from the loss of her little boy and fell further into the depths of addiction in the months and years after he died. She too, failed by a system that by design spits out our most vulnerable. And how true is that? The first time, now she talks about her history with this woman. I think this is interesting. The first time we met was at McDonald's in Dubbo in October 2017. It took me a year to find her. We cradled burnt coffee and spoke about heartache. She was frail and wearing a kind of brokenness that only the loss of a child can bring. She was 37, but you could have mistaken her for being a decade older. She wanted answers, and I promised her we would get them, and justice. That's why Justice Kavanagh's verdict means so much, because at hours of phone calls to this mum of 5, who shares my age, I listened and cried with her. We cried when I detailed his injuries: perforated stomach, broken left femur, a constellation of injuries to his head, face and neck. Injuries experts during the trial compared to those suffered in a high-speed car crash. I had to tell this grieving mum because the police did not. And I will never forget the howling, guttural pain that came from this woman who was served up a life she did not deserve when I told her that his little bottom had been interfered with. How does a mother ever reconcile that? They rest together forever now, this beautiful young boy and his shattered mum in the lawn section of New Dubbo Cemetery. A slate grey marble headstone etched in love, with flowers and toys that he never got to play with hugging the sides. I first learnt this story in late 2016 when an industry whistleblower told me there had been a suspicious death of an Indigenous child in care somewhere in rural New South Wales. But where? His death seemed forgotten, most likely laying at the bottom of a dusty stack of unsolved crimes in a detective's office. But then he had been dead almost 2 years. This hasn't been discovered for that length of time. This is horrific. The tip followed the discovery and exposure of the death of a 15-year-old foster girl that we called Girl X. She had overdosed in a residential care facility 2 weeks before her alleged rapist was to go on trial. Overdosing had become her modus operandi, a cry for help when things were getting tough. Following a short life that New South Wales Deputy Coroner Derek Lee summed up in 2016, saying, "If you could write a textbook on how to traumatise a child, it would be Girl X." And I just want to add to this, Clinton traumatised by the department as well, because she was in care. She too was supposed to be protected by Uniting. Yeah, I love this bit. the God-fearing organisation that, by their own words, claim to acknowledge the corrosive effects of inequality and affirm that the poor and marginalised must be our focus. I have found 3 unresolved foster child deaths in their books. Suppressions and redacted reports mean that I can't tell you if there are more. It was March 23rd, 2015 that our little foster boy died, found unresponsive by paramedics after a 000 call that recorded the foster mother telling her partner they're going to think I bashed him. Varying accounts of the night's events were detailed to the 2 teams of paramedics who tried with everything they had to breathe life back into him. But by Justice Kavanagh's reckoning of the evidence, it seems likely that the deceased was already dead. Her behaviour, when interviewed by detectives just hours after he was pronounced dead, was rather bizarre. Justice Kavanaugh observed, in the sense that she smiled and even cracked the odd joke with the officers. There'll be 2 police interviews. Each time she gave off differing accounts. But it was the evidence of a 13-year-old biological daughter, of what she saw and heard happen in the bathroom on the night he died, that brought her mother's lies undone. It was on her way to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The daughter saw her aggressive at him, like towards him, and when he was standing, she just sort of like pushed him to be sitting, a bit rough around the waist. The teen scurried back to her room, waiting for the yelling to stop before getting up to go to the toilet. Her mum had scuffled outside for a cigarette. Her foster brother was still in the bath. 30 centimetres of water covered his little body. He did not make a sound. He was motionless. Except for those hazel eyes, they blinked, but did not cry. I remember his face having like small cuts on it, and his forehead having a bump on it, and his eyes like his eye area having a bump on it and bruises, she told detectives. Back in her bedroom, she heard the yelling begin again. I sat for a bit, and then went to my little brother, and I asked him if he could go to tell Mum to stop yelling at the deceased. She would tell police in 2019, 4 years after his death. It was 4 years after her first police interview that she told police what really happened that night, because on the way to speak to detectives in 2015, a week after the murder, her mum demanded she omits what she saw in the bathroom. Now 20, the biological daughter was found to be a credible witness, doubling down during the trial, defiantly telling Justice Kavanaugh what she saw that night. I can tell you the whole conversation, but I remember being told too that in the interview I leave out the bath. The mother had been drinking the night of the murder. By her own admission, she confessed she consumed 5 or 6 beers at a get-together at their neighbours earlier in the night. Her daughter told the police when she drinks, she can get aggressive. The court heard she was angry her foster child had been fed twice. The only reason was ever given for her temper that night. Despite the little boy dying in 2015, it took detectives until 2018 to lay charges, a delay in the process criticised by Justice Kavanaugh and a previous Supreme Court bail application. Both judges concluded the bulk of the evidence used to lay the murder charges had been collected shortly after his death. The accused wasn't charged until 8th of January 2018, nearly 3 years after the deceased's death, Justice Kavanaugh noted in his judgment. She then did not stand trial until January 2022. None of the delays was of the accused's making. I spent my roster's days off on my own money researching and agitating and annoying and asking and questioning police neighbours, why had this child been forgotten? I found him in August 2017. She was arrested and charged with his murder the following January. The trial was initially set down for December 2020, but the case was further delayed after the prosecution failed to obtain the required expert medical witness for the case to go ahead. As such, the extended delays entitled his killer to be granted bail, where she was housed in a halfway motel, where vulnerable children had been placed for their safety. Each misstep prolongs the pain of a family so desperate for closure. Closure it took 7 years to achieve. If he was an Anglo boy from a wealthy suburb, would justice have taken so long? His older sister asked, her voice breaking, tears running down her cheeks. I can't believe she's been convicted. This is what we have been fighting for so many years. I know they'll both be watching down on us. They're here with us. And I know that women can't hurt another child, and my brother has justice. But why did it have to take so long? And what about all the other dead children that were placed in care? Where is the accountability? She, a mother of 3 beautiful little children herself, now is desperate for answers. But will those in power respond? There are shutters on the courtroom reporting of cases involving foster care and added shrouded to an already suppression-laden child protection industry. Freedom of information requests return without answers, or if you are lucky enough to get a response, it's usually so heavily redacted, it's useless. So I'm not going to apologise for that taking so long, everybody, but it was important that I read through all of that report, because there are so many questions that we all need to ask, and with so many questions we need to have answered. Do you want to comment about that, Clinton?
Yeah, I just on the last bit, 3 years it took for that to reach a conclusion. 3 years. I can't imagine what they were doing in the meantime. I think because he was a foster kid, they probably threw his file to the back of the queue.
Yep, and I think because he was not just a foster kid, I think because he was also an Indigenous kid, that put it very much to the back of the queue as well. And I think each of these stories highlight the department's need for, their need for lack of transparency. Because in each of these cases, we know that there's someone who's responsible for whatever happens, for the incorrect placement of this child, for the decision-making process along the way, for choosing not to work with the mother, for not understanding the horrors that the mother went through when the child was first removed, and then the horrors that the mother went through when she discovered that her child has possibly been sexually abused or had been harmed in some way, and then eventually dies. So, we entrust Clinton, this system, to supposedly care for kids. And there are too many cases where it's obvious that it doesn't. What do you think?
I think it's a national problem. We were only talking about this a couple of weeks ago where a child had died in care. It's well and truly a national problem. It doesn't just happen in Western Australia or New South Wales or South Australia. And then when we find that these things happen, politicians and child protection cover it up. They hide it.
Yeah.
And they try to change the narrative of what happened. We see this all around Australia all the time.
Yeah, I just noticed here too that, we do. I think, look, we at CPP have people contact us about the way the system abuses them and treats them, and I think it's horrific. And Tracy Cumberland says here, I noticed that the worker needs to be held accountable because the deaths will continue, and they will. If they started charging workers, it may offer a warning to other workers who breach duty of care. And, it's like the Chloe Valentine case here many years ago in South Australia, where the workers weren't reprimanded as such. In fact, some of them got promoted around the death of a child. And, I know that we're having more and more social workers leaving the field who are talking to us about what it's like actually in the workplace, and how prejudiced workers are, how abusive they are, how they put people down, how they refuse to work with them. And there is even some cases that have come to us recently where it's evident that the department are placing children with drug users and other people while their biological parents, are clean of drugs. So I mean, the system is horrific and we need to find ways to change it. Clinton, thanks for the feedback too, mate, and thanks for presenting us with that article.
No
It
worries.
was extremely important. I'm just going to stay there, Clinton. But I'm just going to talk about another issue which may interest some people and some people may not. Who knows? But there's an election being held here in South Australia on the 19th of March. I'm inviting all those people who live in South Australia to vote for a new party that I'm now associated with, and the party is called Real Change SA. I've just got a bit of a clip of them here. I'll just play this just to give you a sense as to who they are. Now we were asked to join Real Change SA because we weren't able to find a way to fund a campaign of our own, even though we had two candidates in the wings. We just didn't get the funding. No one's to blame for that. Would have been nice to have had it, but we weren't able to get the funding. So we chose not to do anything. But then Real Change SA, which is run by Stephen Polaris, who was the director of the Department of Public Prosecutions here in South Australia some years ago, and obviously a solicitor. He asked us to join because we did have the experience of running elections previously. We've run 2 elections, and we also had a presence out there, and he also appreciated the policies that we had developed in relation to producing better outcomes for kids, not just child protection, but kids' mental well-being, youth suicide, better quality education at schools, looking after kids with disabilities, bullying at school, all that sort of stuff, which concerns us. And he has some interesting policies in regard to giving women a voice when it came to as rape victims, so they could be heard in court, so it was easier for them to tell their story. And he also had some issues around which we'd support, and we have policies anyway, which is about domestic violence victims not being forced to leave their home, but for perpetrators to be forced to leave the home. So, and these are policies we agree with. He has a whole lot of other policies around climate change, a whole lot of other stuff that we thoroughly support. So we actually have. I've actually had to resign from the Child Protection Party and join Real Change SA because that's what's required by law. I can't belong to 2 parties, but it does give us an opportunity to. So I'm second on the Legislative Council ticket. So when it comes, and Stephen obviously would be first across the line, I will be second across the line if we can get enough votes. So we need everyone in South Australia to do 2 things. We need you to ensure that you tell your friends about Real Change SA and that you get them to vote. The other thing that we're going to ask of you to do is to volunteer to the Child Protection Party to actually do some work with us on election day, so that we can have a whole host of people at polling booths handing out how to vote cards for Stephen and myself through Real Change SA. And I guess what we're also asking for, if you've got some donations, we're doing a lot of social media stuff, so you'll see a lot of social media come across our Facebook and YouTube pages, and we would like you to share as many of those posts as they come. So it'll seem odd that some stuff's coming across from Real Change SA, but you do need to remember that this is about finding ways to elect myself so that I can enact policies that are about child protection type issues, so that you can have. We've been promising for years that we would be able to provide a voice for you so that you could so that you could have that voice that you need, so the questions you need answered can be answered in Parliament. We're now providing that opportunity to you so that you can have that voice, albeit through Real Change SA. I'm the same person that I was before. I'm still doing these live feeds. I'm still involved in the Child Protection Party in this area, and certainly in terms of meetings and other things that we're doing. I just can't belong to the party anymore because I've had to move to the other so I can get elected, hopefully. If I don't, things just simply move back to the way that they were. But if I do, it will mean the first time in Australia that you will have a direct representation in Parliament. So issues like the one we've talked about today, this would be heavily questioned within Parliament if we were there. Stephen and I are disruptors. We are there to upset the status quo, to shift the thinking so that children and women rise to the top of the conversation. And everything that we do is about ensuring that children and women have a voice. So we're asking you to vote for Real Change, to help to support us financially or in person, to volunteer for us. And to volunteer for us, you just have to send an email to admin@childprotection.party and get onto a list, and Avery will organise places for you to go on election day to help out hand of vote cards, which are really, really important. So any further comments about that, please make them, and stay in contact with us at the Child Protection Party, because we are about representing you. So thanks everybody for being here. I'm just going to finish with the Real Change video, just a brief video, just to let you know who you need to support at the next election. Take care everybody, look after yourselves and be safe.